All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everybody. And welcome to our workshop, Reading Across the Disciplines and OER. And so if I'm not mistaken, so Morgan, you are a co-facilitator, but also Emma as well, correct?
Yes, we started Reading Across the Disciplines around back in 2011, 2012, and we've looked at kind of a variety of solutions to the challenges our students and really society as a whole faces with making sure we're getting the most from our reading. So OER is a perfect fit for that since most of us are reading online.
Right. All right. Thank you. Yeah. So I am not an OER guru, but I did adopt OER starting in 2017, and one thing led to another, and I was asked to be the OER campus lead for Maui College, and so here I am sharing some information about OER, and then Morgan and Emma will kind of tie things together with how it's all connected with reading skills and so forth. So let me go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Voila! All right, so thank you to everyone who is here, who showed up. And so we're going to take a look. I'm going to spend probably about 15 minutes or so just kind of giving you an overview about open educational resources. What are they? What are some of the advantages to them and considerations before adopting OER, if that's something that might be interesting to you, if that's something you would consider. So first of all, what are they? So Hewlett Foundation defines OERs as teaching, learning, and research resources released under an open license that permits their free use and repurposing by others. So these are materials that are available to anybody. They're free. And there are certain characteristics to these materials that make them pretty interesting, pretty great for what we do, teaching. And so I want to share, first of all, what are called the 5 R's of open content. And so first of all, so we can, with OERs, we can keep copies of whatever they are, right? So these could be, OERs can be textbooks, they can be assignments, they can be PowerPoint presentations, they can be videos, they can be lots of different things. And so the first R is that we can retain these. We can make copies and we can keep them, download them, store them, duplicate them. We can also reuse them. And so if you want to use them in classes, or if you want to put them in videos, or if you want to include them in websites, you're welcome to do that. You can also revise them. And this is kind of a pretty cool thing, because if you get an open educational resource, an OER, for instance, let's say it's a textbook and you like 80% of it, but you're not thrilled with the other 20%, or if you don't like the order in which the chapters are set up, or what have you, you can tweak it, you can change it, you can change it so that it suits whatever your interests are in terms of how you want to cover the material, but you can also change it in terms of making it more customized to whoever your students are, for instance. So one example would be maybe putting in open images that reflect our students, right? Like local people here in Hawaii. And then you can remix it. So this is actually kind of connected. You can revise it, but you can remix it as well, which I kind of already got into that. But yeah, so if you want to take, you could take, for instance, chapters from this particular resource And then you could take chapters from another resource and combine them together if you wanted to do that, right? So you can bring in different pieces from different, areas, different pieces of OER, and then create something that's new and different and kind of mixed up. And then you can redistribute OER, so you can share it with other people freely, right? So why consider adopting OER? So there's 4 things here: accessibility, affordability, customizability, and quality that we'll kind of talk about. I kind of already hinted at some of these a little bit, but so accessibility. So this is one of the things that I liked when I first adopted OER, is that students have access to the materials on the first day. So I just noticed that a lot of students were waiting on like financial aid to be able to get their books. Their books were lost in the mail, or they were just taking a long time to get over here from the mainland. And a lot of students actually don't even buy books or have them. They try to just skate through without even having a book. It's kind of shocking. We'll look at some kind of stats on that. But so being able to have, the one thing that I really noticed right off the bat when I adopted was that it was nice that every student would have the material that minute, right? Before, actually, because I send out an announcement, before the class even starts, and like, hey, here's your textbook, right? Here's a link to it. So they can have immediate access to the learning materials, at least in a digital format, right? And most things are digital these days, but so that's nice. You can also access a lot of the different OERs through apps or downloadable interactive PDFs. You can also access many of them just online, so you can view them online, or you can download copies, or like with my OpenStax textbook, for instance, students have the option to download a free app, and then they can access it on their phones or on their tablets. They can also read it online if they want to, just by like jumping on their computer. But they're also able to download a PDF so that, if their Wi-Fi goes out or something, they have a hard copy, kind of, well, digital copy rather, that's on their computer that they can access. And then most of them you can also, or at least many, you can also order print copies, like, a paperback or even a hardbound book. So like with OpenStax, if you really are the type of student that needs a physical kind of textbook in your hand, which, I'm one of those types of students, then it's nice to be able to order, a book that you can, write in and highlight and just, bend into the corners of the pages and all that sort of stuff if you want to. And just the feel of having a book in your hand. So for instance, with OpenStax, students have the option to purchase for $37 a hardbound textbook, brand new, which is pretty good because, they're usually a couple hundred for something like that, but it's optional. And not all of them are as amazing as OpenStax, to be sure, right? There's some OERs out there that are, less than awesome. We'll talk about that. But in general, there tends to be a lot of different formats for a lot of the materials, and that provides flexibility. It makes for easier access for students of various kind of situations. So another thing that's obvious is the affordability factor. The materials are free, so OERs are open. Students don't have to pay for them. Instructors, teachers don't have to pay for them. And this is a pretty big thing. There are a lot of studies out there actually on students' textbook purchasing behavior or lack thereof. And on the lower end of these different studies, it shows that about a quarter, like conservative figure, is that about 1 out of every 4 students just isn't buying a book. And that's typically due to the high cost. So And in cases where they do, there's a lot of students, a lot of people in general are struggling even more than ever now with this whole kind of COVID pandemic thing. And so a lot of students will either forego the textbooks, or if they do, they're going to forego something else. And that's not good. That's an obstacle. And so the fact that the materials are free is, we're removing one obstacle. There's plenty of obstacles. Let's try to remove what we can to student success. So I mentioned customizability, and I think this is really a really big kind of value here, or a big advantage to OER, because the reality is that I think pretty much all of us have, we have had textbooks from publishers and they're like, wow, this is really great, except I don't really care for that. Ooh, this is done really well, but nah, I'm not really a big fan of this over here, right? And I would like to kind of switch things around, and I don't really like the way the order of this. And the reality is that no matter where we get materials, whether they're OER or they're from other major publishers, they're usually not perfect. And so one of the nice things about OERs is that we can customize them, as I said. So being able to kind of create them the way that we want them, based upon our own pedagogy, based upon how we want to order things, is really, I think, a nice feature of these. And then why adopt OER? Continued. So this one I think is really fascinating. Perhaps this is one of the most interesting benefits to adopting OER. And this is student input and collaboration. And so one of the things that a lot of teachers are doing out there is actually getting their own students involved in the generation, the creation of, and adapting or revising of OER materials. We can't do this with a publisher's, textbook or their materials. They're all set and we can't change them. We can't do anything like that. But one of the nice things here with OER, and that a lot of instructors are now doing, is getting their students involved. So creating assignments where their students are being asked to evaluate the material and provide feedback and input. So this is helpful, right? Because if you do that with a regular published non-OER textbook, hey, take a look at this, my students, and evaluate it. Great, you don't like this, this could be better. Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about it. But in this case, we can actually take their feedback and make adjustments to the materials. And now the students are actually participating in this. They have a stake in the game. There's something that they're investing in it, and they're more likely to be involved. So we can ask students to identify gaps in the content, missing information or examples, ask them to help us update, could be vignettes, or it could be photos, or whatever it is, the examples that are being used in the text. Sometimes they get kind of outdated and something new comes along that's really way more kind of apropos or something relevant to what's going on. And this is a way that we can actually get their input. So to have them kind of breathe new life into the materials. I think that, a lot of kind of related to like stereotypes, gender language, stuff like this. It's out of step in a lot of cases. And so being able to kind of get that stuff updated with the help of the students is really kind of a neat thing. So inviting students to contribute to the creation or revising of open license content that lives in the public domain. So this is stuff that they can contribute to, and it doesn't necessarily have to remain in the class just with that instructor. You can create these materials, and that's the whole kind of idea, is that, hey, let's create something, let's change something or create something new and share it with the world. And then, this other school gets a hold of it and they're like, wow, this is great. Hey, but you know what? Let's tweak it a little bit so that it kind of fits in with more what our students population is like here, or situations that we are, face here in our community. Let's get our students involved and kind of rallying around the creation and revising of the materials, in our place. So this is kind of so engaging students in meaningful open pedagogy, places them as content creators and editors rather than consumers. That's kind of the idea. And to be really honest with you, so I work with people who have done this. I haven't done it yet. Okay, I have not done it yet. I just adopted a new OER textbook for my social psychology class, and that's been keeping me really busy. But so, and then another thing here, why adopt OER quality? And this is really, I'll be honest with you, it's a spectrum. There's some just stinky OER materials out there. There's also great materials out there as well. So, it can be hit and miss, but I think the reality is that we can find materials out there that are pretty good. Some are great. And if we can't find something that's pretty good or really great, the whole thing here also is dive in and do something to create something that's great. So, but the quality, there's pretty good quality stuff out there. Publishers like OpenStax really deliver some nice materials. So if you're going to consider adopting, there are some things that you should keep in mind. So first of all, are there materials already out there available for what you teach? Okay. Are these materials good? I mean, are they adequate? Are they going to work, right? Or not? If not, we have to maybe create something. Are you willing to invest the time and energy needed? So adopting, whether we adopt from, an OER materials or adopting from other major publishers, there's usually some work involved. And I know publishers try to make it pretty easy and make it very easy to say yes and just stick with it and don't go away. But there's some really good stuff out there as well in OER and good ancillary materials and stuff, but it takes time, right? Adopting and changing things up takes time. So are you willing to do that? And then are you willing to create new materials for your courses if the materials aren't out there already? So these are real considerations because this is time and energy down here. And even hunting for stuff is time and energy, but it's usually not that big of a deal to hunt around and find what's out there. And then, so if you want to learn more about OER, we have a workshop coming up here. So here's my little plug for a training opportunity coming up on November 2nd, 9th, and 16th, it looks like. So like an hour and a half thing. And so I definitely want to encourage you to go check out that. This one is a synchronous kind of workshop thing. And I'll throw a link into the chat here in a bit later for anybody who wants to check out that. And any questions? Sorry, I went over my time. I'm a bit distracted, just so my apologies. But I'd love to hear any questions or comments. Anyone?
Yeah, we also have time, maybe time at the end for questions too, if everybody
Oh,
wants
good.
to wait.
Yeah, that's cool. Sure, that makes sense to me. Okay, so there's some resources in here I can share also. A copy of this I can imagine with you all later. We can figure out how to maybe email it out if anybody wants it. But there's resources in here and also a link to the workshop that I mentioned. Okay, that's my part. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Hi, everybody. It's Morgan Andaluz here, chiming in with Emma, co-founder of Reading Across the Disciplines. Thanks, Paul. I'm going to do a little screen share here of my very brief presentation. I'm not going to talk very much. But I kind of want to come in as just a little caveat, if you will, to what Paul is saying about OER. And I was listening to a podcast the other day. I can't remember which one. I listened to probably too many podcasts. And in this conversation, they were talking about how our human brains haven't adjusted to our modern environment. And that is kind of increasingly the case. And I think some of the things that Emma's going to talk about are kind of right up that alley. But I just want to reiterate, like these shifts that we're all experiencing, I think that we're even feeling sometimes somewhat overwhelmed by, are also new for our students, you know. And I think a lot of the conversation around digital natives and all of that doesn't factor in some of the things that we know to be true about our particular students. And so I'll just kind of start off there. I'm thinking about like before all of this shift to digital texts began, you know, how much effort and energy were you putting into choosing the best possible textbook, for example, right? And it was hard to find. You know, the more that I think about this, the more I realize like it's always been kind of hard to find a book that's a good book that's going to engage your students, right? It's probably like the quest for the Holy Grail. It's never going to happen, right? And then meanwhile, here we have this tectonic shift to, you know, everything digital and it's very shiny. And I just want to come in and say there's some things to think about, right? If you haven't, and some of you probably already know this stuff. What we know is that our students are coming to us with fewer literacy skills, fewer like challenging reading coping skills than ever before, right? It is true that OER is convenient and cost effective, but it's also true that it adds sometimes one more layer between a student and a digital text, right? And you can all think about how you felt about your students' ability to connect with reading before we made this crazy shift to everything being online, right? Did you feel like students were engaging in their readings and connecting deeply? You know, and I'm going to just say probably a lot of us, maybe not. Actually, can I get a show of hands? Like, how many of you felt good about your student engagement with reading? You can raise your little hand emoji. Or if you have your camera on, you can actually raise your hand. How many of you felt good about your students and their level of engagement with text before you shifted to digital? Or feel good now?
Good is a strong word.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of hands. I don't know if that's because everybody has gone to the snack drawer in their closet, or if because it's kind of like the way I felt, which was often frustrated, which is why Emma and I even started RAD. But one of the things that I want to just highlight is that student accessibility, it's an equity issue, right? And one of the things that people talk about is the need to make access to texts easier and cheaper. And I want to push back on that a little bit and say, yes, of course, but, right? Is somehow we have to be careful that we're preserving the quality of text in the shift, and that we are doing more as educators to lift students up to the level of engaging critically with texts rather than, you know, potentially dumbing down the text because it's the cheaper one that's available, right? Which I think Paul talked about, right? It's really important that we consider quality. And I love the idea of getting students involved in interacting with the text, maybe publishing their own thing. Like, we absolutely need to change the way we think about what a text is and the role that texts play in the building of knowledge in our courses. So those are just some things that I wanted to put out there. What can we do? You know, don't compromise quality. But if you can find a good OER, it's really important that, you know, you talk to students about how to approach that digital text. I'm just curious, from the peanut gallery, the room of Zoom screens, what are the kinds of things that you do when you're reading a digital text that might be different from when you're reading a print text? I'm just curious. You can put it in the chat if you want, or you can just shout it out.
Can you repeat it one more time?
Yeah. So what do you do when you're reading yourself, when you're reading something that's digital that might be different? And let's say something that's hard, okay? That might be different from when you're reading something in print. Yeah. Kelly says, with digital texts, I skim more and absorb less. Squint my eyes. Yeah, that's a big one. Zone out with the digital, right? And so I have an issue too. I don't know if you all do, with like how overwhelming it can feel to be trying to access things that are available in multiple tabs, or when there are too many bells and whistles in a digital text and hyperlinks, right? It can kind of be overwhelming. And when you think about adding that to a student who maybe doesn't have the same, not maybe, who definitely doesn't have the same coping strategies that we have as professionals, theoretically, right? What are we doing to address that gap? You know, I don't know. I'll leave that question out there for you all to think about. So one of the things that you can do is talk to your students about why you selected OER. I think getting them involved, as Paul said, in this process, right? But then also a conversation about what they might be losing in the bargain of choosing the cheaper text, for example, over the more expensive textbook, assuming that there's a better quality, which isn't always the case, right? Really, really important that you help students by modeling strategies for reading digital texts. And what are some of those strategies? You know, and how do you do it? Like a lot of you talked about how you maybe aren't so successful with reading digital text. So really then emphasizing that the numbers show that students are more successful with texts when they have a physical thing to mark up, right? How many of your students are trying to do their reading on their cell phones? I'm going to say an awful lot of them are. And is this the best approach? Yeah, I'm just curious. Does anybody out there, yeah, everyone, right? So what can we tell our students to make them more aware of some of the challenges around digital reading? If they're all reading on their phone. And Patrick is saying it's necessary to separate textbooks as catalogs of the content of the course from textbooks as reading assignments within the canon of the field. Interesting. Patrick, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can explain it. I come from history, so you know what I've found after 22 years of teaching is that maybe history is more different from other fields than I taught. But
Yeah.
But one of the things that I have a problem with is, and I guess I have to divide it between my first year survey courses and my later, you know, second, third, and fourth year courses too. But a textbook like the ones that you often got when you were in world history or Western Civ is really just a kind of compendium, right? It's not even a secondary source. It's built on primary sources. It's this massive thing that just sort of serves as the content of the field. Whereas in history anyway, and I'm quite sure this is true for other disciplines, I'm just ignorant of them, but we have a canon, right? I mean, there are texts that you should read, and of course nobody reads them all, but there are texts that you should know. You should have read by the time you finish college, you should have at least read the Communist Manifesto. You should have at least read Spengler. You should have at least read certain books, and many of these are not available digitally, although, you know, as copyright changes over time, some more are becoming available digitally. But this is the problem I have, is that I'd love to go OER with a lot of things, but that canon is just generally not available in OER. So that means then, do I create courses that are sort of mixed, in which case it's not a zero textbook course, right? A TXT zero course. It can't be. I have a film course where we talk about world history and film. I really actually have to ask my students to get a subscription to at least Amazon. And that's another digital question, right? But this makes TXT zero a kind of joke, because
Well,
for history anyway, right? TXT zero works only if everything can be digital. So I sometimes wonder, I mean, I use TXT zero and OER as separate ideas, but packed together in my world history courses. Because they're surveys, I can use them, even though the material, as Paul said, isn't always that great. But it also means that I have to work very hard to find primary sources all the time that are both digital and worthwhile.
well,
So
sorry
that's,
to interrupt, because I think you just outlined what one of the major concerns that I have, and I know a lot of folks in the English department, this is something we talk about a lot, you know, which is back to that, you know, is cheaper always better? And, you know, you did a really good job of articulating why it's not in your case, right? And I think, you know, I think we should all consider the impacts of emphasizing that textbook costs zero. You know, are students choosing those classes because it's the cheapest, or are they choosing those classes because it's going to be the best for them and for their future? You know, it's a whole nother conversation. But
Yeah.
I think you make a really good point, which is, you know, there's all different kinds of texts in all kinds of disciplines. And in my response to your situation is, it sounds like you've really thought about why you're doing what you're doing. So keep doing that and talk to students about it, right? You know, obviously there are things like, you know, you can get probably Kindle versions of some of the canonical texts, even maybe from like a public library source. But I think, you know, up next, we can deal with those individual students who have financial challenges or barriers to, you know, barriers to accessing textbooks, rather than changing our whole system because of that handful of students who have barriers, if that makes sense.
yeah.
Can I jump in just to, because I think this is Patrick raises an important
Yeah.
point. I want to also clarify. So I think that one thing that, you know, from an OER perspective, look, if there's not something out there that's high quality, right, don't do it, obviously. Or if you want to, go take whatever that resource is and make it better.
Right.
But so yeah, I would never advocate to you know, adopt materials that are subpar. But I think that there's another thing here. If there are, you know, high quality materials out there that are OER, yeah, it makes sense to adopt them. Because any of the OER materials, really, for the most part, that you can get online digitally, you can also print them out. Like, for instance, you know, at Maui College, I mean, we have, you know, I don't know, $1,000 or something set aside to print out whatever students want that's OER. So, and through the publishers, actually, the OER publishers, usually the textbooks you can get printed out for $10, $15 a shot. So if it's a high quality, you know, resource, you can still get a physical copy almost invariably for really cheap. But there are situations where, forget about zero cost, right? Can I find superior materials that I can get to my students for less money, right? We don't ever want to, sacrifice the quality, just to save a few bucks. So I think that, and the last thing I would say is that OER is fantastic for a lot of courses out there, but it isn't currently fantastic for every course. And so that's why you really got to look at it. What's available? What's the quality? Is it good enough to be, will it do what I need it to do? And if not, either create something or get something else that isn't OER. Like that's,
Right.
I would definitely say that.
Yeah, well, and I think that we ought to consider pushing back on any pressures to label courses as cost zero, because I think it's false advertising, really. That's maybe a conversation for another day. But then, okay, so you have identified some resources that you want to use that are OER, right? By all means, be sure that you direct students to print those where they can print them out inexpensively, right? In the English department, we have a wonderful secretary who supports us by printing out and binding resources for free that we get to students. Something that I really recommend, because it's not your imagination that we all read better on physical texts. There are people who have developed a level of mastery with digital text, but that takes extra work. And I can tell you right now that most of our students are not those people. So it's just good to kind of be aware of the fact that this new barrier exists, that there are many pressures in students' lives that are going to lead them to want to do things like read texts on their cell phone, right? And we have to just be proactive in addressing those. So if you have students that you see that are demonstrating, really great comprehension, have them share what they're doing, right? Talk to students, model with students exactly how you approach digital texts. Hold students accountable for reading and interacting by asking them to submit weekly notes, and you can use a style of notes that is applicable for whatever your content area, whatever your discipline note-taking style is. And incidentally, this kind of thing will really help to improve their writing if they're needing to like pull out supporting evidence from the text and weave that in. I found teaching literature classes and English 100, when students have to do research papers, if they've taken notes and written down, chapters or page numbers, then it's a lot easier for them to go back into those texts and pull out quotes that are going to make their writing better. So those are just some of the things that you can do. And then, just very briefly, I do have to say, our eyes and our necks are suffering from a world where we're looking down with the weight of our melon heads. So it's not a bad idea to talk to students about things like, doing that thing where you stare off into the distance for 20 seconds every 20 minutes, adjust your, I know, Paul, you're the one, Paul, don't you do some kind of like yogic breathing with students too? Like some kind of exercise that refocuses their eyes. And I need to do that right now because I have the wrong readers on and my eyeballs hurt. I keep taking them off and squinting. My eyes have gone to total hell. But there's a lot of things that you can do.
I do not have a regular yoga practice with my students. I don't know where you heard that from.
No,
But I do.
you know what? I think it was Jeff Jackson in the English department. Now that I don't know why, for some reason, I'm confounding you. But he does.
I do have my students meditate in my Psych 100 class once.
Yeah, well, I mean, anything though, like to just where you're talking to students about the fact that we're interfacing with these machines, but our bodies aren't designed, and the machines aren't yet designed to really take into account some of our weaknesses. And so the result of like many years of staring at screens is that we're all, losing our vision, having eye strain, headaches, neck problems. Talk to any chiropractor.
For sure. I mean,
Right.
and the reality is that all of the publishers not OER by itself.
Right.
I mean, even more so maybe regular, all the major public, everything is
Yes.
going digital. And in
It's
fact, we're
happening, right?
creating-
Yeah, it's not something that we can, you know, resist now. Give me my
Hard.
textbook, you know.
It's an uphill battle.
Yeah. No, or we can just embrace it with the little asterisk and say, okay, well then what are the best practices, right? And until our bodies, our caveman bodies catch up with the switch to digital, you know, what are the things that we can do to support our students? And I think just showing up for this workshop shows that you're all concerned about supporting your students. And I am pretty much done talking. Emma, are you here? Did you get you got your battery back?
Yes, I'm back.
All right. And I'm
That's a
passing the buck
perfect
to Emma.
segue. Great. That's a perfect segue. The concept of our Neanderthal brains and bodies adjusting to a world of infinite options and information. So one thing I keep hearing, which is kind of at the heart of RAD, is thinking about yourself as a reader and what makes you successful or unsuccessful as a reader, and sort of transferring that into the OER spaces or the online reading space. So what that means is thinking about when you're reading, what do you do online to help you stay focused? And I'd ask you, if you have any ideas there, to just put an idea in the chat for something you might ask your students to do or something you do yourself that helps you stay focused when you're reading, whether it's a regular book or an online book, but particularly something that's on a screen. Could you go ahead and just drop that into the chat right now? Reading aloud, interesting. Taking notes. Let's see, what else do we see here? Inserting notes into PDFs, physical notes, getting, oh yeah, I love doing that, getting a PDF actually to read it out loud to you. Screenshots, ooh, that's an interesting strategy. I've never done that, I like that. Isolating the article, definitely gonna ask you to explain that one, Cheryl, because that's one of my favorite strategies. But what I'm hearing is that because you all are successful academics, you read a lot, you've inevitably had to think of yourselves as readers processing information. And whether you know it or not, you've developed strategies to get through text online. And that doesn't mean that our students know those things. So just like we talk about generally with reading across the disciplines, the key is to communicate that information with your students and to create some guidelines in the beginning of class. And so some guidelines that I would suggest you use are from the Center for Humane Technology. It's, I guess you would call it a think tank that studies the impacts of technology on mostly our learning and our mental health, but on our society in general. It's been created by a bunch of people who are refugees from Silicon Valley, who probably have a lot to do with the situation we're in right now and probably feel a little bit guilty about it. But I would encourage you to check out this website. But the part I want to share with you, this is really simple. I encourage you to do this sort of, I know I don't have much time, and I just wanted to give you a few things you can do. So the first one I'd ask you to do is to ask your students and to put it in your syllabi or to include it in an assignment to turn off notifications and to alter notifications on their laptops and on their phones. And what that will do is help their attention when they're reading, because they're not going to be constantly getting a pop-up notification, ding, 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 Pavlovian bell that reminds them that so-and-so posted a new post about such and such. As you know, if you don't change the notifications on your phone or your laptop, it's designed to completely wreak havoc on any focus you might have every 3 minutes. So for a lot of you, that might seem like, oh, well, yeah, I already do that. I can't believe my students don't. But in my experience, when I ask students to turn off their notifications, half of them are shocked about the difference it makes in their quality of attention and learning and focus. So I think this part's really important, to turn off notifications on their phones and their laptops as they read. Another one is I'm going to just show you these helpful tools. These are some tools that allow you to block sites on your laptop. And I encourage students to install a blocker for when they're working on a certain part of the day at least. And you can time your blockers so that, they don't interfere with your ability to use your laptop in other ways at different times. So that's here too. This is a site that you can, share with your students. And you could even ask them, choose one or two of these strategies and then write me back and see how it works. Some of these are not necessarily related to reading, but they're all related to our attention. So I did want to share those with you, but those two ones in particular, which is turning off notifications and installing a blocker, are probably two that you can quickly ask students to do that will make a big impact on their lives. And I've put that link in there too. Another thing that a lot of you have already shared in the chat is that when you're reading, you make sure to do something physical at the same time. I always equate reading on a screen with something that's very slick. It just slides right off of your brain. And we know that neuroscience shows us that when we read, we need it to be really sticky, like sticky peanut butter. And screens are just too slick. When we read and we're just gliding right over the page, we're not actually learning. So thinking about what makes things sticky, taking notes physically makes things sticky. Making annotations, using an annotation tool, most of the e-readers have them, even just typing notes that way. Even recording notes verbally through a recorder. Anything that allows the reading to become physical is going to allow memory to take place, meaning making to take place. So these are things that maybe you do naturally, but your students might not do naturally. So I would say if you require it, if you grade it, even if you don't even look at it, if you just give it credit for it being done, it will massively impact your students' attention and it'll massively impact their reading comprehension. And of course, then your happiness with teaching the class. And most of you do know that. But I wanted to check in with Cheryl when you I don't have the chat up here with me anymore, but you mentioned something interesting. Do you want to speak up and elaborate about that strategy?
Well, it's just that if there's a particular article, often there's things on the side and everything else around it. So I either enlarge it, so it's the only one there, or there's also controls usually that you can isolate the article so that you actually get the whole article if it goes to several pages. And so that's the only thing that I'm actually looking at or reading and not distracted by something that's beside it or above it or whatever.
Yeah, that's one of those things that comes, it's a personal habit that you've created that I think a lot of other people could benefit from. So I just love hearing those kind of examples. And it is an example of sort of sticky learning or sticky reading, and even just simply talking about learning with students. A lot of students don't know that reading is hard for us too, and that making learning stick, that sticky process, when it feels sticky, that's actually that feeling of it being difficult is when our neurons are actually helping us make and forge connections that are going to help us learn later and read later. And understand and recall our learning later, which is the kind of reading we want to be doing. A lot of students feel like if it's easy and smooth and they're just gliding right along, that, oh, they get it, they understand it, and they're a good reader. Making sure that students really understand that having to follow up about page 62 with the question you wrote on the side of the page, that's real reading. So making examples of that, incorporating it into your class, I think is a really powerful thing. And related to attention hygiene, I shared these take control tools, but also just setting up a standard in the beginning of class. If you think that students shouldn't be reading on a phone, making sure early on that your students have the technology that they need. Some of our students might not because of financial reasons. So the cool thing about our libraries right now is they all are offering laptops for free that students can borrow. So just identifying through a survey or a student discussion with a student in the beginning of the class, identifying how they plan on reading, and then making a plan for that. So you can identify early on what those issues might be. So if a student says, oh, I got that textbook 0 and I'm going to read it on my phone, you can kind of make a plan to deal with that early on in the semester. Yeah, I'm seeing some chats, so I wanna jump in and check them out. Let's see. Patrick says, I sometimes read to students, record himself reading the text, commenting on it. So when you can show that you're having a conversation with the text. Yeah, making those conversations visible is extremely important for students, particularly because a lot of them don't know that they have the right to have that voice and that conversation with the author. But that even if they don't know it completely or understand what they're reading completely, that concept really goes far in helping them check for understanding. Because if they're not able to paraphrase or respond to the text, that means they don't understand that concept, or they need to work through it more. So requiring those conversations and then giving credit for those conversations, which we might also call annotation or sometimes paraphrasing, these are things that allow students to check their own understanding really early in the process, so that it doesn't kind of blow up in their faces, 3 weeks later, right before the exam. And also talking about these concepts of efficiency. I heard Morgan and Paul speaking earlier about, what actually saves money and what actually saves time. And a lot of these strategies, they do take more time in the beginning, but they lead to lasting understanding so that students actually have to read less repetitively in the long run. So it actually does save time. But yeah, I mean, these are not things that are foreign to you, but I think it's just about being really intentional about how you set it up in the beginning and having those conversations with students. I would love, we've got exactly the right amount of time for a little bit of discussion and questions. So let's go for it. And if you don't have a question, you can share a comment, but I would just ask that everybody share either a question or a comment. And you can just either speak up or you can put it in the chat.
I have a ton of questions. I'm just curious, Emma, lately, have you found that students are more aware, less aware, or the same of the impact of certain technologies like social media and their cell phones?
I don't know if it's because I have a lot of conversations with students about this, but I have found a lot greater awareness, at least from the mental health perspective, about just needing to get offline and really scheduling life outside of being online and how important that is to mental health. My students and I talk a lot about that. We also do a time diet where, not a time diet, it's not a diet, it's a reflection, I guess, where students basically catalog everything they did in hour increments for a week, and they reflect on it, and then they decide whether it fits within their goals and their standards, and a variety of reflections. And almost always they let me know that it doesn't really line up, but they also over the years, I think, have become much more aware. And I see a lot more of this sort of, I got distracted and so I installed a blocker, or I got distracted and so I sold my PlayStation. There's definitely a much greater awareness of that. So I'm actually really hopeful. And what I do see also is these conversations about reading digitally that seem kind of maybe so obvious for us, students are really hungry for it. They're tired of spinning their wheels and they want to talk about this stuff. And they particularly want to know when something is stacked against them, right? They want to know the secrets to success. And there really are secrets to success when it comes to managing your attention online, and that it's not your fault. Your brain is made this way, and this technology is made another way to distract you. It's not your fault, right? So it's not your fault, but it is your problem, right? And dealing with it that way. So I've got some other comments. Let's see. Does reading on something like a Kindle work on the brain in a way that is in between reading? Yes, it does. Kindles are more like physical texts in the sense that you're not going to get any other pop-ups besides an ad for like a weird romance novel that you don't want to buy, I've noticed. but you don't have sort of the gateway drug access to all the other websites that are going to distract you. You don't have that dopamine addiction risk, I guess you could call it. But the downside for some people about Kindles is that they cannot annotate as well. But that is where those conversations can come up with your students about, well, how do I physically interact with a Kindle? How do I take notes on a Kindle? And I'm always amazed when I have that conversation about how many ideas students have. You've always got that one or that those 3 students who are about to go to nursing school who are telling you these strategies for note taking that even you didn't know existed. So having those conversations with how to maybe deal with that with students would be helpful. Cheryl says, I have students do a survey about their learning style and we discuss ways to cater to their learning style. Interesting. Even though we know that learning styles are preferences, right? They still are preferences. And students need to know that they can deal outside of those learning styles, but also understanding how those learning styles can fit within all types of teaching and learning, I think is really valuable. Kelly says, hi Kelly. I joined a RAD workshop a few years ago and learned from you how to use sticky notes with students to help them engage with their reading. It was a great tip. I've been trying to figure out how to use sticky notes in digital format. Jamboard can be a helpful app for that. Also, OpenStax has digital tools for highlighting and note-taking in their open textbooks. You know what, Kelly, I have been so curious about OpenStax. Which of those would you find, like if you could suggest, if I had to choose between OpenStax and Jamboard, what would you suggest?
Oh, I'll just say I got to use an OpenStax textbook for the first time last spring with a developmental English course, and it was great. I think, but that's a commitment to a whole textbook unless you just use pieces of it. But with Jamboard, it's an app linked to Google. So sometimes I have students read and everybody posts a sticky note on the class Jamboard. But
So
I miss
same as
paper.
Flipgrid? I know, I do. Is it the same as Flipgrid, or have you tried Flipgrid?
Flipgrid is videos. Jamboard is
it can be like text.
You can share like a screen, and then everybody can add a little digital sticky note with a comment. And I think you can even make it anonymous. So, it's just everybody. So imagine if we have a wall and we're together in person, we can each put a sticky note on the wall. It's basically duplicating that in a digital format.
I think I recall watching you at an HSSI modeling the sticky note, or maybe it was a video of you doing it. Anyway, the physical sticky note all over the walls didn't I see you do that one? It was so cool.
I don't know if that was me. I don't know. I love sticky notes though, but I learned that from you guys.
That's awesome.
I would pass out sticky notes in my face-to-face classes and have students write like, I think you said like vocabulary. So just make, and it's so small. So it's kind of low stakes, low pressure writing, but it really got them engaged. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're so welcome. And, it does remind me to sort of share with you that several of you have brought up, these in-between spaces where it's not completely online, it's not completely physical, or maybe it's a spectrum. And that when you have reading happening online or you have class happening online, there can still be physical things happening too. So I imagine, until the Internet of Things invents digitally connected physical Post-it notes, which I'm sure they will. It'll be like Alexa Post-it notes. But before that, I mean, you can physically take notes. You can physically write on Post-it notes and screens at the same time. But it's really kind of a weird creative space to be in where a lot of us are figuring this out together. But I love these ideas. Any comments or questions?
I want to just jump in and say thanks for sharing that, Patrick. That looks like a really cool resource that I did not know about. So I will be stealing that. But it's like the MIT annotation tool.
Web.
Yeah.
That does look cool. Yeah, there's so much out there. And that's the thing, is you really can't go wrong, because asking a student to do something with their reading you've done your, I mean, if they're doing it, you've done the job, because they are going to learn more from that reading than if you didn't ask them to do it. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be right. But they're going to come to your class more prepared, and they're going to better understand where their confusion lies. Yeah, good old number 2 pencil. That can also work. Yeah.
Your old woman.
So, yeah, and like, some people wonder, how do you collect these things? Because we know students a lot of times don't do optional. I ask students to take screenshots. I ask students to take videos just with their phone. If it's just like a physical textbook, they can video it. They can also video the screen if they're showing me screen annotations. There's lots of ways to do it kind of simply. It doesn't have to be pretty. It's just kind of getting it done, I think, is really what matters.
I was going to say, so on the heels of what you've been talking about, Emma, that so there's a part of, because, I'm kind of an old dog. I like just a physical textbook and stuff, but I've noticed, to be honest, over the years that I am seeing the benefits of digital materials, that they provide, I think, vastly more flexibility, being able to go into those materials, search for words, and just quickly access different information, digitally create notes and highlighting and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of benefits to that. And it looks like that's the direction that we're all of the publishers is like, you have access to a digital copy of whatever it is, and for this many months or whatever. So I think what you are doing with RAD, by figuring out like, how do we get students to engage more effectively with the materials that they're increasingly using, is so important, because it's just here and it's not going anywhere, and if I'm really honest, it's like, it makes me wonder, like, part of it is that I'm just an old dog, and it's like, I grew up with regular physical books and I love the feel of it, and I do actually feel boxed in when I have something digital that I can't just quickly flip through the whole thing, like, oh, I know where it is, and flip through the pages and it's like right through here, but at the same time, I think that the frustration of not having access to that with so many things that we're reading online is also ameliorated to some extent with the
options
that are available with the digital stuff. So I think that this idea of like, well, okay, so how do we engage in it, right? How do we do it effectively is so important.
Yeah.
Irrespective of whether it's OER, it's, it doesn't matter.
And
How
I think that that's really important, that it's important to note that it's not just an old people thing to prefer a physical text, right? That numbers show that there are a lot of younger college students who recognize the value of a print text. It depends on, it's like in writing, you have to think about subject, audience, and purpose, right? It's like, what do you need to do with that text? And, you have to weigh in your mind, the functionality that's lost and the functionality that's gained.
Yeah.
Right. And we're just helping students to have that conversation and to maybe veer away from the conversation that goes something like, I do this because it's easy, or I do this because it's the cheapest way.
Yeah. Well, obviously we could talk about this all day. I know our time is almost up, but I do want to make sure that we've answered questions. And I'm also going to put a link into a photo that I used from a blog that was about making it stick, making the reading stick. There might be some ideas in there that help you. Lawrence, any questions from you? I can imagine annotating automotive technology would be really important. Thanks, Paul. Okay, well, maybe everyone is satiated on this Friday. I've been checking the news like a mad woman, hoping that we would get some progress on these bills that are trying to get through. So I know we've all been a little distracted in our own ways. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you everyone for coming. And, you know, I think that the really important thing to remember, the kind of rad motto, or I don't know, I'm calling it a motto now, is just be kind to your mind, helping students realize that it's completely natural to be distracted, but how do we deal with that? Instead of thinking something's wrong with them, that they are being distracted. I think that when we can get that into our heads, we can provide strategies for students and identify strategies in ourselves that we want to demystify for students as well. Thanks, everybody.